I remember the silence of that room more than anything else. It wasn't the kind of silence you hear in libraries or churches. This one was heavier, like the air itself carried the weight of unfinished words. The lawyer cleared his throat, a polite signal that our time together was about to begin. I sat on the edge of a wooden chair, hands pressed tight in my lap, trying to look braver than I felt. My father's will lay in a manila envelope on the table. The paper was thin, but it felt somehow heavier than stone. When the lawyer began reading, his voice was steady, professional, but mine, inside my chest, was trembling. Every sentence sounded like a note from a song I never wanted to hear. He spoke of assets, of property, of accounts, words that should have meant security, stability. But all I could think of was the man who was no longer here to explain them. And then came the line that froze me in place. All holdings, savings, and estate shall pass in their entirety to my daughter. I felt the words strike me almost physically. Entirety, everything. The lawyer kept reading, but I barely heard him. My mind was spinning, because my father was not a man who ever cared much for money. He was not a man who boasted of what he owned. If anything, he was a man who gave away more than he kept. So why would he leave everything to me? I left the office with the folder pressed against my chest. Outside, the world had no idea what had just been spoken inside those four walls. People hurried across the street. Car horns blared. A bus rolled by, carrying strangers to their ordinary lives. And I stood there, suddenly feeling both richer and poorer at the same time. That night, I sat alone in the house I had grown up in. The same walls that had heard my teenage outbursts, the same floorboards that had carried my father's tired footsteps after long days at work. Now the house seemed too big, too quiet. I opened the folder again, reading every word by the dim glow of a lamp. Each line was cold, formal, but beneath the ink I could hear my father's voice. Not the booming voice that scolded me when I stayed out too late. Not the gentle voice that hummed lullabies when I was little, but a quieter one, a whisper. It was as if he was saying, "This is all I have, and it is yours because you are all I have." I wanted to be grateful, and part of me was. But another part, the larger part, ached with confusion. Why had he never spoken about this? Why had he chosen to leave everything, not divided, not shared, but entirely in my hands? And why did his last gift feel so much like a riddle? As I walked through the hallway later that night, I noticed the details I had once ignored. The coat he always wore, still hanging by the door. The kitchen clock, ticking away the hours he no longer had. The photograph of the two of us on my graduation day, his arm around me, his smile brighter than mine. It struck me then how much of his life had been built around me. Every corner of the house whispered it. Every shadow seemed to remind me. And yet, it wasn't until the will was read aloud that I truly understood the depth of what he had sacrificed. Lying in bed, sleep far away, I let my mind wander back. Back to the times I caught him staring out the window, a softness in his eyes as though he was thinking of a life he had turned away from. Back to the evenings when I asked why he never dated and he'd laugh it off with a shrug. "Who needs company when I've got you?" he'd say. At the time it sounded sweet, but now it haunted me. Had he given up more than I realized? More than he ever allowed me to see? The will should have been an ending, but to me it felt like a beginning, the opening line of a story I had never heard before. A story about my father's choices, his sacrifices, and maybe his secrets. I turned off the lamp. Darkness filled the room, but in that darkness I could almost hear him again. That same whisper, steady and tender as if carried on the breath of memory. "Daughter, you are my everything." And though I clutched the inheritance in my hands, I realized something far greater. What he left me was not money, not property, not land. It was the truth that I had been loved beyond measure, in ways I had not yet begun to understand. I grew up watching my father move through life like a man carrying two lives at once. There was the visible life, his work, his errands, his quiet meals at the kitchen table. And then there was the hidden one, the unspoken responsibility he carried after my mother passed away far too soon. Most men, I imagine, would have remarried. They would have sought someone to share the weight, someone to fill the silence in the evenings. But my father never did. Instead, he learned to split himself in two. In the mornings, he was brisk and practical. I can still hear the sound of his boots on the kitchen floor, a heavy rhythm that meant breakfast was nearly ready. The air smelled of burnt toast more often than not, and sometimes the eggs were overcooked, but I ate every bite because I could see the effort behind them. He'd pack my lunch in paper bags, pressing the fold down twice with calloused fingers. And then, before handing it to me, he'd tap the bag gently, almost like a seal of protection. Afternoons were different. He was no longer just the provider. He became the coach in the backyard, calling out encouragement as I stumbled through softball practice. His laughter carried across the grass whenever I missed a swing, not mocking but full of warmth. He became the audience at every school recital, clapping louder than anyone else, his whistle sharp enough to echo in the gymnasium. Other kids would roll their eyes when their parents embarrassed them with too much applause, but secretly I lived for those moments, because his voice in the crowd made me feel like I was enough. Nights were the hardest. When the day slowed down and the house grew quiet, I would sometimes wake to the sound of him moving through the kitchen. The clatter of a single plate, the low hiss of the faucet. I would peek through the doorway and see him washing dishes he had used hours earlier, as if keeping his hands busy might keep his mind from wandering. There was always a loneliness around him then, faint but undeniable. It lingered like the faint smell of coffee grounds in the sink. I didn't understand it fully at the time, but I felt it like a cold draft slipping through a window left open. He tried to fill my world with normalcy. He learned to braid hair, though the braids were lopsided and loose. He learned to sew buttons, though the thread always knotted at the end. He signed permission slips with a pen that left smudges across the paper. It wasn't perfection, but it was devotion. And devotion, I would later learn, is stronger than perfection could ever be. As I grew older, I started noticing the invitations he declined. Neighbors would ask him to join barbecues, and he would smile politely, saying he had errands to run. Coworkers sent holiday cards with photos of their spouses, but my father never appeared in those gatherings. Sometimes when the house phone rang in the evening, he would let it ring once, twice, 3 times, and then pick it up only to say he was busy. I used to wonder who was on the other end. Now I think I know. He was turning down chances at companionship. He was keeping his circle small because he believed I needed to be at the center of it. I can still picture one particular winter. Snow had piled against the windows, the kind of storm that made the world feel far away. We huddled in the living room with blankets, the old heater clicking and groaning in protest. I remember looking up at him, his face lit by the glow of the television. There was a softness in his expression, as though he had finally allowed himself a moment to breathe. And I asked without really thinking, "Dad, don't you ever get lonely?" He paused. The question seemed to surprise him. Then he smiled, slow and tired. "Lonely? No, not with you here." I wanted to believe him, so I did. For years I carried that answer as truth. But looking back now, after the silence left behind, I see it differently. I see a man who chose me over himself again and again. A man who folded away his own longing and stitched my life together with both hands. A man who stood at the crossroads of desire and duty and always turned toward duty. He never remarried. He never let another woman into our home. He chose instead to stand alone, so I would never feel like I had to. And in doing so, he built a world where I believed I was enough to fill his life. Only now do I realize the cost of that choice. There was a time, though I only learned of it later, when my father almost let himself begin again. It was years after my mother's passing, at a point when the sharp edges of grief had dulled into a quiet ache. He had grown into his role as both parent and provider, his days filled with routines he carried like second nature. Yet there was still a part of him, I think, that longed for something more. Her name was Evelyn. I remember the first time I heard it. Not from him, he was too careful with his words, but from Mrs. Callahan, our neighbor who seemed to notice everything that happened on our street. She mentioned it one afternoon while trimming her roses. Her voice dipped with a kind of knowing sympathy. "Your father's been seen with a woman at the market," she said, pruning shears snapping through the air. "Pretty thing. Always wears a red scarf." At the time, I shrugged it off. The idea of my father with someone else felt almost impossible, like imagining a mountain suddenly deciding to move. But weeks later, I noticed small changes. He shaved more often. His old gray jacket, usually thrown over a chair, was brushed clean and buttoned neatly when he left the house. There was a faint scent on him when he came home, not cologne exactly, but something softer, floral, as if it had lingered in the air around him. And once when I walked past the hall table, I saw a folded note resting by the phone. The handwriting wasn't his. The letters curled at the edges, graceful and deliberate. I was too young to press him about it. But I wasn't blind. On Saturdays, when I pretended to be buried in books, I could hear the rhythm of his voice through the walls, lower, gentler, as though he was speaking into a part of himself he usually kept locked away. The sound made me strangely uneasy. Not because I didn't want him to be happy, but because happiness, his happiness, was something I had never considered before. I realize now how selfish that was. Children often are without meaning to be. Still, he seemed lighter in those weeks. His eyes, usually weary from work, carried a brightness, a flicker I hadn't seen since I was very small. Even the house seemed to change around him, as though some invisible breeze had lifted the dust from the corners. And then, just as suddenly, it ended. The calls stopped. The red scarf no longer appeared on our street. The folded notes vanished from the hall table. What remained was silence, thicker than before. At dinner one evening, I asked without thinking, "Did you ever want to get married again?" He looked at me then, really looked. His fork paused midair. A long moment passed before he set it down. "I had a chance once," he admitted, his voice quiet, almost reluctant. "But I couldn't take it." "Why not?" I asked. He reached for his glass of water, but his hand lingered against the rim without lifting it. "Because it would have meant changing the life we had," he said. "And I didn't want you to feel like there wasn't room for you." I tried to respond, but no words came. I hadn't realized he'd been weighing choices that way, choices where my presence was the deciding factor. Later that night, I crept into the living room where he sat alone. The television glowed faintly, but the volume was turned down low. His eyes weren't on the screen. They were on a photograph he held in his lap. It wasn't of me. It was of Evelyn. The picture was small, edges bent from being handled too often. Her smile was soft, her eyes gentle, and for the first time I saw my father not as the man who raised me, but as a man who had longings of his own. When he noticed me standing there, he slid the photograph under a stack of papers. He didn't scold me for intruding. He didn't explain. He only said, "Some dreams, sweetheart, are better left unfinished." Then he kissed my forehead and sent me off to bed. I carried that image with me for years, the picture of him holding a life he could have chosen but didn't. At the time, I believed he gave it up because he thought I wouldn't accept it, that he was protecting me. But as I grew older, I began to sense there was something else behind it, a calculation perhaps, or a sacrifice tied to more than just emotions. What I know is this: Evelyn never came back. He never spoke her name again. And whatever chance he had at building a new life slipped quietly into the past, leaving only traces behind, like perfume that lingers long after the wearer is gone. And my father, the single father, kept moving forward, carrying me with both hands, carrying his silence with the other. My father never spoiled me in the way other parents did. There were no surprise vacations, no sparkling cars tied with ribbons in the driveway, no extravagant gestures you could photograph and post for the world to see. His indulgence lived in smaller, quieter corners of life, so quiet, in fact, that I didn't recognize them as indulgence until much later. When I was 12, I wanted a bicycle. Not just any bicycle, but the gleaming blue one in the window of Carter's Hardware. It had chrome handlebars that caught the light like silver wings, and a little bell that chimed with a sound sharp enough to cut through summer air. We didn't have money for it, I knew that. I had overheard enough grown-up conversations to understand bills came first. But one Saturday morning, he wheeled that bicycle into our yard, the paint shining as though it had been waiting for me all along. I remember running my hand over the smooth frame, the cold metal warming under my skin. "How did you?" I started to ask. He shrugged, almost embarrassed. "Traded some extra hours at the machine shop at the plant." I didn't know what that meant until years later, when I realized those extra hours were nights he should have been resting, mornings he should have been home. The pattern repeated itself in countless ways. In high school, I wanted to join the debate team, but the trips were expensive. He never told me no. Instead, envelopes appeared in the kitchen drawer, each one filled with enough cash for the next tournament. He would wave off my questions, saying something vague about cutting back. What he cut back on was himself. I remember his boots growing thinner at the soles, the leather peeling at the edges. I remember him reusing the same thermos until the paint chipped away. He never complained. He never even mentioned it. His indulgence wasn't about giving me what I wanted. It was about giving me what I needed to feel like I belonged in the world. College was the clearest example. I had applied to schools I thought were out of reach, places with tuition that could swallow a lifetime of savings. When the acceptance letter came, I held it like a fragile bird, afraid to crush it with reality. But he insisted. "You'll go," he said, with a certainty that frightened me. That first semester, I learned how heavy tuition really was. Every time I checked the bursar's office, the bills had already been paid. It wasn't until later that I discovered he had taken out a second mortgage. He never told me. He carried that secret like he carried so many others, folded neatly into the background of his life. Even in smaller, everyday things, his indulgence showed itself. The kitchen cabinet was always stocked with my favorite cereal, even when the generic brand would have been cheaper. The heat in the house clicked on earlier than it needed to in winter, because he knew I hated the sting of cold floors. And then there was prom. I remember stepping into the living room, nervous in a dress I thought was too simple compared to the gowns my friends had chosen. He just looked at me, his eyes shining in a way that made the room blur. "You look perfect," he said. Later, I learned he had sold an old hunting rifle to pay for that dress, something that had belonged to his father, passed down through generations. He let it go so I could walk into a single night feeling beautiful. At the time, I didn't see it as indulgence. I saw it as life. Normal, ordinary, the way things were. It wasn't until years later, when the house was empty, that I could piece it together. Every sacrifice had been a stitch. Every quiet choice had been a thread. And the life he wrapped around me was a quilt so warm, I didn't realize the chill he had kept from his own bones. Sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can still hear the soft clink of coins in his pocket as he counted out change for the gas station clerk. I can smell the faint tang of oil on his hands from extra shifts. I can feel the rough fabric of his work jacket brushing against me when he hugged me goodnight. These were the textures of his indulgence, not luxury, not abundance, but love poured silently into every corner of my life. And the truth I only came to understand as an adult is this: he never denied himself because he couldn't afford more. He denied himself because to him I was more than comfort, more than rest, more than the unfinished dream of another life he had once allowed himself to imagine. The house felt different after the funeral. It wasn't just the quiet. I had lived with quiet before, the kind that came when he sat alone in the evenings. This was heavier. A silence swollen with absence, pressing against the walls until even the ticking clock in the hallway seemed unsure of itself. I walked through each room as though I were trespassing, my footsteps echoing on the wooden floorboards. His chair was still by the window, the cushion sunken in the exact shape of him. His jacket hung limp on the hook by the door. The air still carried his scent, coffee grounds, soap, and something faintly metallic like coins warmed by a hand. I didn't come looking for anything that day. I only wanted to feel closer to him. But grief has a way of turning you into an archaeologist, sifting through ordinary objects in search of answers you're not even sure exist. In the bedroom, the top drawer of his dresser caught my eye. He always kept it locked, though I never asked why. The small brass key had been left on the nightstand, as if he knew someone would eventually need it. My hand shook when I slid the key in. The lock clicked open with a sound sharp enough to make my heart lurch. Inside, everything was arranged with a precision that didn't surprise me. Folders stacked by color, envelopes aligned like soldiers in a row, old receipts bundled with rubber bands brittle from age. And then I saw it. A single envelope, cream-colored, its edges softened with time. Unlike the others, this one was sealed. On the front in his handwriting was just one word: Evelyn. The name hit me like a stone dropped into still water. I hadn't heard it spoken in years, not since the evening he admitted there had once been a chance, a dream he chose to leave unfinished. And now here it was, written in the deliberate strokes of his pen. The envelope trembled in my hands. The seal was unbroken. He had written it, but he had never sent it. I traced the letters with my fingertip, the ink faintly raised under the pad of my skin. My chest tightened. This wasn't for me. It was a window into a part of him I had never been allowed to see. For a long while I just sat there on the edge of the bed, staring at the letter. The house around me seemed to hold its breath. The radiator hissed in the corner, then went still. Even the trees outside stood motionless, their branches pressed against the glass, as though they too were waiting. I wanted to tear it open to finally know what he had hidden, but I couldn't. My father had been a man of restraint. He had lived by unspoken rules, protecting me not with grand declarations but with omissions, with all the things he never said. To break the seal felt like crossing a line he had drawn, one he couldn't defend now that he was gone. So I slipped the letter back into the drawer, though my hands resisted the motion. That night, the envelope followed me into my dreams. I dreamt of him at the kitchen table, pen in hand, the lamplight throwing shadows across his face. I dreamt of the way he would pause between sentences, staring off as if searching for the right words, then lowering his head again to write. When I woke, the image clung to me, as vivid as the dawn pressing pale light through the curtains. I went back to the drawer. I lifted the envelope again, and this time I pressed it against my chest, the paper cool and fragile beneath my fingers. Questions tumbled in my mind. Had he written it when I was young, during those weeks when the red scarf appeared on our street? Had he sealed it just before deciding to let that dream slip away? Did she ever know? The letter was more than words on paper. It was a thread tied to the hidden life he never allowed to unravel. And now that thread was in my hands, burning with possibility, daring me to follow where it might lead. I carried it to the kitchen, setting it on the table where we had shared so many meals. Morning light spilled across the surface, illuminating the envelope as though it had been waiting for this moment all along. The kettle whistled on the stove, steam curling upward in silver ribbons. The smell of tea leaves filled the room, sharp and earthy. I sat there with the cup warming my palms, staring at the letter, feeling the air hum with unfinished business. I didn't open it. Not yet. But I knew, with a certainty that tightened every muscle in my body, that my father's story was not finished, and neither was mine. The name followed me. Evelyn. It trailed me down hallways, whispered itself between the pages of books I tried to read, drifted through the low hum of the refrigerator at night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the envelope resting in the drawer, her name pressed in my father's careful script. I couldn't leave it alone. The search began in the smallest ways. I asked Mrs. Callahan, the neighbor who had once mentioned the woman with the red scarf. Her pruning shears paused midair, and for a moment she looked guilty, as if speaking the name years ago had been a betrayal. "I don't know much," she said finally, her voice softened by age. She came around for a while. They looked happy, the two of them. Then one day she stopped coming. People said she moved away. "Moved where?" I asked. Mrs. Callahan shook her head. "I'm sorry, dear. I truly don't know." Her garden smelled of damp earth and roses, but beneath it I caught the faint bitterness of something unsaid. At night I dug through drawers of old papers, hoping for another clue. Receipts, invoices, letters from relatives, all ordinary. But then, tucked inside an old telephone directory, I found a scrap of paper with a single number scrawled across it. The ink had faded, but the digits were still legible. I dialed it, my hands clammy against the receiver. A woman's voice answered, low and cautious. "Hello." For a moment I couldn't breathe, my tongue stuck to the roof of my mouth. I'm looking for Evelyn," I managed. Silence stretched on the other end, then softly, "Who is this?" I hesitated. My instinct was to tell the truth, but the truth felt too raw, too exposed. "My name is Claire," I said, my voice trembling. "I'm his daughter." The line crackled faintly, as though the wires themselves were reluctant to carry this conversation. When she spoke again, her tone had shifted, softer but heavy with something I couldn't name. I wondered when this day might come. Her words sent a shiver down my arms. "Did you know him well?" I asked. "I knew him better than most," she said. Then, after a pause, "but not as well as I wanted to." We arranged to meet the next afternoon at a small cafe downtown. The place smelled of roasted beans and cinnamon, the air filled with the chatter of strangers. I sat at a corner table, my hands wrapped tight around a mug I barely sipped from, and then she walked in. Evelyn. Her hair was streaked with gray now, tied neatly at the back of her neck. She wore a dark coat, plain, but around her shoulders was a scarf, a deep crimson, just as I remembered Mrs. Callahan describing all those years ago. When our eyes met, something inside me shifted. It wasn't recognition exactly, but a sense of connection, like stepping into a room where the walls already knew your name. She sat down across from me. For a while we didn't speak. We just looked at each other, the silence humming between us like a secret language. Finally, she said, "You look like him." I swallowed hard. "Did you love him?" Her gaze fell to her hands folded neatly on the table. Her fingers traced the rim of her coffee cup as if measuring her words. "Yes," she said simply, "I loved him." The air in the cafe seemed to tilt. The clinking of cups, the hiss of steam from the espresso machine, all of it faded until her words stood alone. "Then why didn't you stay?" I asked. Her eyes lifted to mine, clear but clouded with sorrow. "Because he chose you." Those 3 words lodged deep in my chest. She explained it quietly, as though speaking too loudly might undo the years that had passed. They had talked about marriage, about a life together. "But your father," she said, "couldn't bring himself to risk dividing his world. He was afraid that loving her might mean less for me. Afraid that bringing her into our home might crowd out the space he had built around me." I told him I could live with it, Evelyn said, her voice breaking slightly. "That love doesn't divide, it multiplies." But he wouldn't hear it. He thought the best way to protect you was to let me go. I sat frozen, my pulse hammering in my ears. Part of me wanted to argue, to insist he had been wrong, that I would have wanted him happy, that I could have made room for her. But another part, the deeper, more honest part, knew that as a child I might not have welcomed her at all. And so he made the choice for me. The unfinished dream. Evelyn reached into her bag and pulled out a small photograph. She slid it across the table. It was him, younger, standing beside her. His arm was draped around her shoulders, his face lit by a smile I hadn't seen in years. "He kept this one too," she whispered. The paper shook in my hand as I lifted it. For the first time I saw my father not as the man who sacrificed, but as the man who once allowed himself to hope. And in that moment, Evelyn was no longer a shadow. She was flesh and memory, carrying a piece of him I had never known. After meeting Evelyn, I returned to the house with my mind rattling like loose change in a jar. Her words stayed with me because he chose you. They haunted me as I walked through the front door, as I set down my coat, as the silence of the house wrapped itself around me again. I thought I had understood my father's devotion. I had seen it in bicycles, tuition bills, prom dresses. But Evelyn's confession hinted at something larger, something far-reaching. His sacrifices hadn't been spontaneous gestures of love. They had been deliberate, structured, like a map he had drawn long before I realized I was walking it. I began with the papers. His desk was tucked in the corner of the living room, a battered oak piece that had carried stacks of bills for as long as I could remember. When I opened the drawers, I was hit by the familiar smell of pencil shavings and old ink. Inside were folders arranged by year, labeled in his steady block handwriting. I sifted through them, expecting nothing more than routine, but what I found instead was a trail. There were deeds to small parcels of land, each one purchased and then sold again within a few years. There were stock certificates, cashed out long before their value could truly rise. And there were bank records, meticulous deposits and withdrawals that seemed to circle around one purpose. The pattern became clear. Everything he had owned, every asset he had touched, he had eventually funneled into one place: me. The realization chilled me. I leaned back in the chair, the paper crackling in my hands. This wasn't a man simply saving for his daughter's future. This was a man dismantling his own, brick by brick, until all that remained was a foundation built entirely for me to stand on. And the strangest part was how quietly he had done it. No grand announcements, no long lectures about responsibility. Just quiet calculations, sacrifices folded into the paperwork of an ordinary life. One folder in particular caught my eye. It was thicker than the others, bound with a rubber band. Inside, I found documents tied to the house itself. He had refinanced 3 times over the years. Each time the terms grew harsher, the interest higher. He had essentially sold years of his own security for immediate cash, and that cash had gone directly to me. Tuition, travel, opportunities I had once thought of as ordinary, almost forgettable. My stomach tightened. The chair beneath me suddenly felt too large, too heavy, as though it carried not just my weight but his choices stacked upon it. There was one more envelope at the bottom of the folder, not cream-colored like Evelyn's, but plain white. On the front was a single note in his handwriting: "For when she's ready." I opened it carefully. Inside was a letter from the bank confirming the closure of his retirement account. The entire balance had been withdrawn 5 years earlier. 5 years. That was when I had been preparing to leave for graduate school. The year I thought he had simply found a way, as he always did. The year I walked across campus believing I had earned my place there on merit alone. My throat burned as I set the letter down. He hadn't found a way, he had given one up. I pushed back from the desk and walked through the house, my hands trailing along the walls as if I needed to hold onto something solid. The wallpaper was faded, the floorboards uneven. I saw now that this home, too, had been part of his sacrifice. He had kept it standing barely while quietly pouring everything else into me, and yet he had never asked for recognition. Not once had he said, "Look what I gave up for you." Not once had he demanded repayment. Instead, he had built a life where I was meant to believe opportunity came naturally, like air, like water. Only now did I see the cost. That night I sat at the kitchen table with the papers spread before me. The lamp cast a yellow glow, turning the stacks into towers of shadow. My hands shook as I flipped through them, page after page of silent sacrifice. The numbers blurred together, but the meaning was sharp as glass. Every penny had been bent toward me. It wasn't inheritance. It was evidence. Evidence of a man who had chosen again and again to erase himself so that his daughter could be written in bold. The envelope addressed to Evelyn still waited in the bedroom drawer, but in that moment I realized something even harder to face. The truth he had hidden wasn't just about love lost. It was about love transformed, turned into ledgers and signatures, mortgages and withdrawals. Love so fierce it disguised itself as arithmetic. And now, with him gone, it was mine to reckon with. I didn't expect to find a journal. My father was never the kind of man who wrote things down, at least not the things that mattered. His life was lists, groceries scribbled on the backs of envelopes, repair instructions jotted in the margins of newspapers, reminders pinned to the refrigerator with magnets shaped like fruit. He didn't keep a diary, at least not one I ever saw. But tucked behind the folders in his desk, I found a small leather-bound book. The cover was worn smooth, the edges frayed as though it had been carried back and forth, opened and closed, more times than anyone would guess. When I flipped through it, I realized it wasn't really a journal, not in the usual sense. There weren't daily entries, no orderly dates. Instead, it was scattered thoughts, fragments of sentences, lines written in moments when his heart must have been too full to hold them. And one page near the middle had been torn. The ragged edge of paper clung to the spine like a wound. Whatever had been written there was gone, ripped out with enough force that a thin layer of the next page had come away too. On the page before, I found a half-finished line. "If one day she ever understands, then maybe." It ended there mid-stroke, the ink darker at the tip where the pen had lingered before being lifted away. I stared at it, my chest tightening, as if the missing words were lodged somewhere just out of reach. The page after was nearly blank except for a single sentence at the bottom. I chose silence because silence cannot betray. My breath caught. It wasn't like him to write in riddles, but grief makes you fluent in fragments. I ran my fingers over the indentations, tracing where his hand had pressed against the paper, trying to feel what he had felt in that moment. The house around me seemed to lean in. The hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, the faint creak of the pipes in the walls, even the wind outside, all of it faded until there was only the torn page and the space it left behind. I turned back to the inside cover, where a few older notes were scrawled. Dates, addresses. One of them was crossed out with a heavy line of ink, so dark it nearly cut through the paper. Another was underlined twice. I copied it onto a slip of paper, my hand trembling. I didn't know what it meant, but I knew it was part of whatever story he had buried beneath all the bills and sacrifices. The journal smelled faintly of him, soap, tobacco from years past, a trace of machine oil. When I closed my eyes and held it close, I could almost imagine him sitting across from me, bent over the table, scribbling in the same uneven script. But then I opened my eyes, and all that remained was the torn page. I sat back, remembering Evelyn's face at the cafe, the way her fingers had traced her cup while she told me he had chosen me over her. Maybe the missing page had been about her. Maybe he had written something he couldn't let himself keep. Or maybe it was about me. That thought chilled me more than anything. I carried the journal into the kitchen and laid it open on the table. The overhead light buzzed faintly, flickering once before settling. My tea from earlier had gone cold, the surface filmed over. I pushed it aside. The torn page seemed louder in its absence than any words could have been. I thought of the documents I had found in his desk, the mortgages refinanced, the accounts emptied. I thought of Evelyn's photograph, the smile of a man I had barely recognized. And now this, an unfinished sentence, an erased confession. It was as though he had been building a puzzle but had deliberately hidden the last pieces. I ran my hand through my hair, the weight of it pressing against my skull. My body felt restless, like electricity under the skin. I wanted to scream at him for not trusting me, for holding so much back, for leaving me with questions when answers could have been written in full sentences instead of fragments. But then I thought of his handwriting again, the steadiness of it, the care in each letter, and I couldn't stay angry, because maybe silence really was his way of loving me. Maybe the torn page wasn't destruction but protection. Still, the words haunted me. If one day she ever understands, then maybe. Understands what? Maybe what? The questions echoed in my chest long after I closed the book. And I knew, with a certainty that shook me, that I couldn't stop now. Whatever he had torn away, whatever silence he had chosen, I had to uncover it. Even if it meant finding pieces of him I wasn't ready for. It was the address in my father's journal that led me there. A modest house on the edge of town, its porch sagging, paint faded to a pale gray. The air smelled faintly of pine from the trees crowding the yard, mixed with the sharper tang of gasoline drifting from a lawnmower left idle nearby. When the door opened, I saw a man I half remembered from childhood photographs, broad-shouldered once, now stooped, his hair thin to wisps of white. His eyes narrowed at first, but then softened. "You're Claire," he said, not a question but a recognition. "Yes," I answered quietly. "And you knew my father." He stepped aside, gesturing me in with a hand that trembled slightly. Inside, the house carried the musty sweetness of old books and pipe tobacco. The curtains were drawn, filtering the light into muted shades of gold. He motioned for me to sit at a table scarred with years of use. "I'm Martin," he said, settling into the chair across from me. "Your father and I, well, we went back a long way. Worked together at the plant, drank together after shifts, covered for each other more times than I can count." His voice held the cadence of memory, each word weighted. I leaned forward. "There are things I don't understand, about his choices, about what he gave up." Martin's gaze lingered on me, searching my face as if deciding how much I deserved to know. Then he sighed, the sound rasping through his chest. "I suppose it's time someone told you." He reached for a small tin box on the shelf and placed it on the table. The lid creaked open to reveal a handful of faded photographs, receipts, and scraps of paper. He pulled out one picture, my father younger, standing beside Martin, both men in work uniforms, their faces streaked with grime but lit by wide smiles. "Your dad could have gone further than any of us," Martin said. "Management had their eye on him. He was smart, steady, trustworthy. They offered him promotions, better pay, but he turned them down." I frowned. "Why would he do that?" "Because promotions meant travel," Martin explained. "It meant long hours, nights away, weekends swallowed whole, and he wouldn't have it. Said you needed him more than he needed a bigger paycheck." The words sank into me like stones. My father had never spoken of opportunities passed by. He had made it seem like the life we lived was simply the life he wanted. Martin went on, his hands restless on the table. "There was one winter," he said, "when money was especially tight. The company offered overtime, but it was brutal, overnight shifts, dangerous conditions. I took it. Your dad didn't. He said he'd rather patch your coat himself than buy you a new one with money earned while he wasn't home." I closed my eyes, the image forming. My father hunched over needle and thread, stitching warmth into fabric because he refused to trade his presence for a paycheck. "He never told me," I whispered. Martin's eyes glistened. "He wouldn't, that was his way. He believed sacrifice meant more when it was invisible." I asked about Evelyn, though the name caught in my throat. For a moment Martin was silent, then he nodded slowly. "She loved him, I saw it. They had plans once. But when things got serious, he pulled back, told me he couldn't risk the smallest chance you'd feel second to anyone. He said, if Claire ever doubts she's my world, then I've failed." My chest tightened until I could barely breathe. Martin leaned closer. His voice dropped, raw with sincerity. "He gave up more than you'll ever know. Love, career, comfort, he laid it all down. And the world will never see it because he made sure it looked like choice, not sacrifice." The room blurred around me, colors bleeding at the edges. I gripped the arm of the chair to steady myself. Martin's hand, gnarled with age, rested briefly on mine. He was proud of you. Always said he'd live poor, live lonely, live small as long as you lived wide. That was his bargain with life. I swallowed hard, words refusing to form. He never asked for thanks, Martin added, voice breaking. But I think he hoped one day you'd understand. The torn page from the journal flashed in my mind. If one day she ever understands, then maybe. Maybe what? I rose to leave, the weight of the confession pressing into my shoulders. Martin watched me from the doorway, his expression heavy with both sorrow and relief. As I stepped outside, the cool air hit my face, sharp with the scent of pine. The sky had darkened to a deep indigo, and the first stars trembled faintly above the rooftops. For the first time, I felt the enormity of what my father had carried, not as absence but as presence. A presence that had shaped every corner of my life, hidden beneath silence and sacrifice. And now, piece by piece, the truth was breaking through. The box of papers had been sitting under his bed, a plain cardboard thing that looked as though it had once held office supplies. Dust clung to the edges, fine and gray, coating my fingers as I pulled it into the light. I don't know what drew me to it. Maybe instinct. Maybe the memory of Martin's words still echoing. He gave up more than you'll ever know. Inside, among tax forms and old warranties, lay a thin blue folder marked simply legal. My stomach tightened as I opened it. The first pages were routine, property deeds, insurance documents, signatures I recognized as his. But buried deeper, I found something stranger, an agreement typed neatly on law office letterhead. At the top it read, "Mutual dissolution of engagement." My throat went dry. The names stared back at me, his and hers, Evelyn's. The date stunned me. It was nearly 20 years ago, the very time I remembered the red scarf, the softened look in his eyes, the brief lightness in his step. I read the words slowly, my eyes catching on every phrase. It wasn't a divorce. It wasn't even a marriage. It was a contract signed before vows were ever spoken, dissolving the promise before it could become official. Both parties agree to withdraw from any formal union. Both parties release any claim, present or future, to property, estate, or financial holdings of the other. I felt a pulse in my temples, sharp and insistent. He had signed away not just the chance of companionship, but the possibility that his assets might one day be shared. He had made legal certain what silence alone could not guarantee, that everything he owned, everything he worked for, would remain untouched by anyone except me. The paper trembled in my hands. There were signatures at the bottom. His steady, firm. Hers slender, elegant. A notary seal pressed faintly into the corner, the ink faded but unbroken. The sound of my breath filled the room, ragged and shallow. This wasn't just sacrifice. This was premeditated erasure. A future drawn up, then crossed out in black and white. I closed my eyes, imagining him in that office, pen in hand. The air must have smelled of paper and ink, the quiet broken only by the scratch of signatures. Evelyn sitting beside him, her scarf tucked at her throat, perhaps her hands folded tightly in her lap. Did she cry then? Did he? Or did they both pretend it was nothing more than formality, two adults tidying up a mistake, while inside something deeper was being buried alive? I turned the page and found a letter attached, written in my father's hand. It wasn't long, just a few lines. "I do this not from lack of love, but from abundance of it. My daughter deserves a world where she never wonders if she is first in my heart. This is the only way I know how to give her that." The words blurred as my eyes filled. I thought of Evelyn's face at the cafe, the way her voice had broken when she said, "He chose you." Now the evidence was here, ink on paper. Not a rumor, not an assumption. A choice formalized, notarized, sealed away for decades. He hadn't just ended a romance. He had signed a contract with loneliness, bound himself legally to solitude so that my life could remain untouched by doubt. The folder slid from my lap onto the floor. Papers fanned out in muted colors, cream, blue, yellow, like the scattered remains of a life dismantled piece by piece. I sat on the rug, pressing my palms against my eyes, the silence of the house pressing back against me. It felt almost unbearable, this knowledge. To love someone so completely that you would carve away your own happiness with surgical precision, then hide the scar so they never knew. After a long while, I gathered the documents back into the folder. My hands moved carefully, as though the papers were fragile bones that might snap if mishandled. I tucked them into the box, but not before lingering on his signature one last time. Strong, steady, decisive. A name written by a man who had given away everything but me. When I slid the box back under the bed, the dust clung to my skin. I rubbed my hands together, but the grit remained stubborn, as if some part of his choice had fastened itself to me and would not let go. And deep inside, I knew the truth. I was now the keeper of his silence. It comes back to me in fragments the last night I saw him. The house was quiet, but not in its usual way. It was the kind of quiet that presses against your skin, urging you to listen closer. I had been staying with him that week, sensing somehow that his body was tiring faster, though he never admitted it. I remember the smell first. The faint aroma of cedar logs burning in the fireplace, mixed with the sharper edge of his liniment, the one he rubbed on his knees when the joints ached too much. The air was thick with warmth, yet he sat hunched, wrapped in his old cardigan, his shoulders drawn forward as though holding in the weight of years. He was at the table, pen in hand, papers spread before him. I had thought he was balancing bills again, his endless ritual, but the lines on the page looked different. Not numbers, not columns, words. When he saw me, he slid the papers aside. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked. I shook my head. "You neither." He smiled, the corners of his mouth twitching upward in a way that carried both affection and apology. "Sit with me, then," he said. The chair creaked as I lowered myself across from him. For a while we said nothing, listening instead to the soft pop of the fire, the ticking of the old clock above the mantel. His breathing was slow, measured, but I could see the effort behind it, the rise and fall of his chest more labored than before. "Dad," I whispered, "are you all right?" He looked at me for a long moment, his eyes dark with something unspoken. Then he reached across the table and took my hand. His skin was cool, the veins prominent, but his grip was steady. "I'm all right," he said softly. "I just get tired faster these days." The words lodged in my throat. I wanted to push him, to demand truth, but I held back. He had lived his life on silence. I wasn't sure he would know how to give me anything else. Later, he rose and moved to the window. The curtains were half drawn, letting in a slice of moonlight that cut across the room. He stood there for a long time, staring out into the night as if waiting for something. I followed him, standing at his side. Outside, the world was still, branches swayed in the wind, a dog barked faintly in the distance. He lifted his hand, resting it against the glass, and I saw the reflection of his face, lined, weary, but calm. "You know," he murmured, "the hardest part isn't what you give up, it's what you never let yourself hold." I turned toward him, startled by the rawness in his tone. "What do you mean?" But he didn't answer. He only lowered his hand, exhaled slowly, and returned to the chair. When he sat down again, I noticed a photograph tucked into the stack of papers he had pushed aside. For a brief moment, the edge slipped into view, Evelyn's face, younger, smiling. My chest tightened, but I said nothing. He caught me looking, though, and for the first time he didn't hide it. "She was important," he said, almost to himself. His thumb brushed the photo before he slid it back into the folder. "But you were everything." The fire cracked sharply then, scattering sparks into the air. His voice lingered above the sound, quiet but certain, like the final note of a hymn. We stayed awake longer than we should have, talking about little things. Weather, neighbors, a memory of me learning to ride my bicycle, his laughter filling the air. He kept circling back to stories of my childhood, his face softening each time as though he needed to replay them, to hold them in his mind one more time before letting go. I didn't know it then, but I realized now he was saying goodbye in pieces. When I finally stood to leave for bed, he caught my hand again. His grip lingered, firmer than before, almost urgent. "Claire," he said, my name heavy on his tongue, "promise me something. Anything. Promise you'll live wide. Don't let life shrink you. Don't be afraid to take what's given." The words struck me in the chest. I nodded, unable to speak, my throat burning. He released my hand slowly, as though memorizing the feel of it, and leaned back in his chair. That was the last image I have of him alive, sitting by the fire, the lamplight casting long shadows over his face, his eyes closed as though resting, the papers stacked neatly beside him. By morning the fire had gone cold, and so had he. The room smelled of ash and liniment, faint and fading. The photograph was gone from the table, but the pen remained, lying where he had set it down, its tip still stained with ink. I touched it, my fingers trembling, and felt the echo of his last words pulse through me like a heartbeat that was no longer his but mine to carry. I found it by accident. The old cassette player was buried in a drawer of his desk, beneath coils of extension cords and a jumble of batteries that had long since died. The machine was heavy in my hands, its plastic scuffed, the play button worn to a dull shine from years of use. I remembered it faintly, how he used to tape lectures from community meetings or record himself reading notes aloud so he wouldn't forget them. But there was one tape inside, unlabeled. My pulse quickened as I pressed it into place. The machine whirred, the reels spinning to life with a soft click. For a moment only static filled the air, then a voice. His voice. It was rougher than I remembered, grainier, the years etched into every syllable, yet unmistakably his. "If you're hearing this," he began, "then I'm not there to tell you in person." The sound of him, so alive, so close, struck me like a blow. My chest tightened and I pressed a hand against my ribs as though to keep myself steady. "I never was good with words," he continued. "Never good at saying things the way they ought to be said, so I thought maybe this would help." A pause, a breath, the faint scrape of a chair in the background, the rustle of paper. Even those small noises felt precious, pieces of him captured in amber. "I made choices," he said, his tone shifting lower now. "Choices you may never forgive me for, choices you may never even notice, but they were mine, and I made them with one thought in my heart, you." Static crackled between his words. I leaned closer, straining, unwilling to lose a syllable. "There was a woman once. You know that by now, I'm sure. I loved her, more than I ever admitted to anyone, but I couldn't let myself keep her, because love, real love, meant protecting you first, always you, so I let her go." I bit down hard on my lip, the taste of iron filling my mouth. Hearing it from Evelyn had been one thing. Hearing it from him in his own voice, it split me open. "I don't regret it," he said firmly, the tape hissing faintly in the silence that followed. "Not for a moment. But I do wonder sometimes if you'll see it for what it was, not a loss, a gift. The only way I knew to make sure you'd never doubt where you stood in my life." The machine clicked softly as the reels shifted. His voice grew fainter as though he had leaned back. "I wish I could tell you this face to face. I wish I could see your eyes when you hear it, but I've never been brave that way, not with feelings. I built my life on silence because silence was safer." The words lodged in my throat, heavy, immovable. I reached for the table to steady myself, my palm pressing against the cool wood. Then, after another pause, came something softer. "You once asked me if I was lonely. Do you remember?" I said no. The truth is I was most nights. The house can be a hollow place when laughter fades. But then I'd hear you walking down the hall or calling my name or just breathing in the next room. And that sound, it was enough. It filled every corner. I covered my mouth, my breath breaking against my hand. Near the end, his voice faltered slightly, as though he was tired. "If there's one thing I could leave you besides this house, besides the money, it's this. Don't be afraid to take happiness when it comes. Don't turn it away like I did. You deserve to hold it with both hands. Promise me that, Claire. Promise me you won't choose silence." There was a long pause then. Only the soft hum of the tape, the faint hiss of emptiness. I thought it was over. But then one final whisper. "I love you, daughter, more than my own breath." The tape clicked to a stop. The reels froze. I sat there, the machine still humming faintly in my lap, the air around me trembling with the ghost of his voice. My ears rang as though the words were still being spoken, etched into the silence he had left behind. I pressed rewind, the whir of the tape filling the room, and played it again. And again. Each time, the cadence of his breathing, the weight of his pauses, struck deeper, threading themselves into me until I could no longer tell where his voice ended and my heartbeat began. The recorded voice of a man who had built his life on sacrifice. The recorded voice of my father. And now, the only voice that could guide me forward. The house had never felt so vast. Each room echoed in ways I'd never noticed before, as though the walls had been holding their breath all those years and were only now exhaling. The air was stale, tinged with the faint musk of wood and the sharper scent of dust rising as I moved through the halls. My footsteps carried too loudly, each one a reminder that I was the only heartbeat left within these walls. I carried the cassette player with me, though I had turned it off. It felt heavy, like an anchor dragging me backward into his presence. I couldn't let it go, not yet. In the living room, the chair by the window remained as he had left it, its fabric worn smooth where his arms had rested. The cushion bore the permanent indentation of his weight, the ghost of his body pressing against time itself. I lowered myself into it, the springs groaning under me, and for a moment I swore I could feel his warmth lingering in the fabric. Outside, the trees bent in the wind, branches clawing gently at the glass. The sound was hollow, almost mournful, and it made the emptiness inside seem louder. I rose and moved toward the kitchen. It smelled faintly of coffee, though the pot was long cold, a dark ring of residue staining the bottom. Cups still hung on their hooks, their handles chipped from years of use. I ran my fingers along the counter, the laminate cool and unyielding. In the drawer, I found the paper bags he used for my school lunches, a whole stack of them, untouched in years. I pulled one out and pressed it flat against the table. My throat tightened at the memory of his calloused hands folding the top twice, sealing it like a promise before handing it to me. I hadn't realized he had kept buying them long after I no longer needed them. The silence pressed harder in the dining room. The table was bare except for a single placemat, his placemat, the fabric frayed at the edges. A water glass stood nearby, half filled, the surface dulled with a thin film. I touched it and the glass rocked gently, the faint clink against the wood sharp in the stillness. I imagined him sitting there the night before he died, sipping slowly, staring across at the empty chair opposite him. My chair. The thought hollowed me out. I walked upstairs, the air cooler, carrying the dry scent of old fabric and mothballs. His bedroom was exactly as he had left it. The bed neatly made, as though he'd intended to return. His shoes rested by the closet, laces looped loosely. I sat on the edge of the mattress. It dipped slightly beneath my weight, the springs sighing. My eyes fell to the nightstand where a lamp stood, its shade tilted. A book lay there, open but face down, as though paused mid-thought. I lifted it carefully, an old collection of poetry, the margins underlined with a steady hand. I turned to a page where a line had been marked twice. Love is not possession, but the giving away of oneself. The ink was darker here, pressed harder into the paper, as though he wanted those words to outlast him. Tears came then, hot and unrelenting. They fell onto the page, blurring the ink, merging my grief with his mark. I pressed the book against my chest, rocking slightly, the sound of my sobs filling the room that had known only his quiet breaths for so long. I cried not just for his absence, but for the realization that every inch of this house was a monument to his silence. Each object, each mark, each habit carried the weight of what he had chosen to deny himself, and now all of it was mine to bear. When the tears finally slowed, I lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling. The plaster was cracked in the corner, a fine web of lines spreading outward like veins. I thought of his voice on the tape, telling me not to choose silence, not to turn away from love. Irony burned. He had signed contracts of solitude, torn pages from journals, locked away words he could never say. And yet in the end he wanted me to live differently, to take what he had refused. The ceiling blurred above me. The house creaked with age, shifting slightly in the wind, its timbers groaning like tired bones. I closed my eyes and listened. The faint hum of the refrigerator below, the tick of the hallway clock, the whistle of air through a loose window frame. Ordinary sounds, yet in that moment they felt sacred, carrying traces of him. For the first time I allowed myself to grieve not only the father I had lost, but the man I had never fully known. The man who had filled these rooms with sacrifice so complete it had hidden itself in plain sight. And in the quiet of the empty house, my tears fell again, not out of despair, but out of love too vast for words. The dining room was the hardest place to enter. I had walked past it a dozen times since he died, always quickening my steps, my gaze fixed forward. But on that evening something drew me back. Perhaps it was the fading light, the way dusk spilled into the house, painting everything in the soft gray of endings. I pushed the door open. The hinges groaned, a tired sound that carried into the empty space beyond. The table sat in the center, square and modest, its surface scarred with scratches from years of use. Two chairs faced each other, one pulled in neatly, the other angled outward, his. On the table, the remnants of his last meal remained. The plate was still there, a faint ring of sauce clinging to the porcelain. A fork rested diagonally across it, as though set down mid-bite. The glass beside it was half filled with water, its surface clouded slightly, a film of dust catching the dim light. I stood frozen, the air thick with the faint sourness of food gone stale, mingled with the dry scent of old wood. It was as if time had stopped the moment he left, sealing the room into a fragile memory. I pulled out the chair and lowered myself into it. The wood was cold beneath my palms. Across from me, the empty chair seemed impossibly wide, a gulf I could not cross. I tried to imagine him there, his shoulders slightly hunched, his hand curled around the fork. He would have looked up when I entered, offering his familiar half-smile, the one that said he was tired but glad to see me. But now the only sound was the faint rattle of the window pane in the evening wind. I reached out and touched the plate. The porcelain was chilled, its surface rough where the glaze had worn thin. My throat tightened. It wasn't just a meal he hadn't finished. It was a life. On the placemat, a folded napkin lay untouched. I lifted it, pressing the fabric to my face. It smelled faintly of soap, faintly of him. The scent was almost gone, dissolving like breath in the cold. I closed my eyes and let the tears come. They fell silently, darkening the cloth as though my grief could stitch itself into the fibers. When I opened my eyes, the room swam with the blur of memory. I saw us sitting here years ago, me as a child, legs swinging beneath the chair, him urging me to eat my vegetables with mock sternness. I saw birthdays, the table crowded with candles and laughter. I saw quiet evenings, just the two of us talking about nothing and everything. And now nothing but a fork left mid-motion. I picked it up, the metal cool against my skin. I turned it over in my hand, studying the worn tines, the faint scratches etched from years of use. It was so ordinary, so small, yet it felt like holding the final trace of him, as if his fingers had just released it into mine. I placed it back down gently, aligning it with the plate. The sound of metal against porcelain rang louder than it should have, echoing through the room like a final word. The hunger in the room wasn't his anymore. It was mine. A hunger for answers, for one more conversation, for one more moment of him looking up from across the table. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the wood, my head in my hands. The silence pressed against me, heavy and unrelenting. And yet beneath it I felt something else, an undercurrent of presence. As though he were still here, watching, waiting, reminding me that his life had been poured into mine, even if the meal remained unfinished. The light dimmed further, shadows pooling across the table. I struck a match and lit the small candle in the center. Its flame flickered, casting a warm glow over the abandoned plate, the glass of water, the napkin now damp with my tears. The scene shifted under the light, no longer just evidence of an ending, but a reminder of all the evenings that had come before. I whispered into the stillness, my voice trembling. "I'm sorry I wasn't here." The flame wavered, as though stirred by breath I could not hear. And for a fleeting moment, it felt like I wasn't alone at the table. The candle on the dining table had burned low, its wax pooling at the base, hardened into ripples of white. The half-empty glass still stood beside his plate, and the fork I had realigned rested as though waiting for him to return. But no one was coming back. I carried the candle with me to his study. The flame trembled in the draft as I set it down on the desk, beside the stack of papers I had left untouched since the night before. The shadows it cast swayed across the walls, stretching tall, bending, shrinking again like restless souls. I pulled a sheet of paper from the drawer and smoothed it flat. The desk smelled faintly of ink and cedar, the air carrying the dry hush of old paper. I reached for his pen, the same one that had left its imprint on mortgage agreements, contracts, even his silent farewell to Evelyn. This time, it would hold my words. The pen felt heavy between my fingers. For a long while I couldn't begin. My hand hovered over the page, trembling. My chest rose and fell in shallow breaths, as if the act of writing to him might summon him back. Finally the words broke through. "Dear Dad." The ink bled slowly, the first line stark against the pale page. My eyes blurred almost immediately, but I pressed on. "I should have said these things when you were still here. I should have told you every time you folded my lunches, every time you sat through my recitals, every time you traded your hours of rest for my chances at something better. But I didn't. I took it all as ordinary. I thought that was what fathers did. And now, with the chair across from me empty, I finally see the truth. What you gave was never ordinary. It was extraordinary in its silence." I paused, the weight of the words settling. My fingers ached from gripping the pen too tightly. "I know now about Evelyn. About what you let go of and why. I met her, Dad. She told me you chose me. She told me you let her walk away because you believed it was the only way I'd never doubt your love. And now I've seen the papers, contract you signed, the promises you cut from your life. I don't know whether to thank you or to cry for you, so I'll do both. Thank you for loving me more than yourself, and forgive me for never realizing what that love cost. A tear fell onto the page, smearing the ink into a soft blur. I let it stay, part of the letter, part of the truth. I've also heard your voice. On the tape. You told me not to choose silence, not to turn away from happiness like you did. I promise I'll try, Dad. I promise I'll take the love that finds me even if I'm afraid. I won't shut the door the way you did. That's the gift you left me, isn't it? Not the money, not the house, but the courage to live wider than you allowed yourself to live. The candle sputtered beside me, a drop of wax sliding down like a slow tear. The flame flared, then steadied. I leaned closer to the page, my heart pounding as though he could hear me through the ink. You once told me you weren't lonely as long as I was in the house. I believed you. Maybe part of you even believed it too, but I know better now. And still, I want you to know I would have sat with you every night if I'd known how deep that quiet went. I would have filled the space with every word I never spoke. And though I can't change the past, I can say it now. You were never alone, Dad, not then, not now, not ever, because I carry you with me. In my voice. In my breath. In the life I will keep building in your name. I stopped. My hand trembled, the pen nearly slipping from my grip. My whole body felt lighter and heavier all at once, as though every sentence pulled something out of me even as it stitched something back in. I signed it simply. Your daughter, always. Then I set the pen down and read it through, my lips moving silently over each line. The candle had burned lower, the wax spreading across the base in a crooked pattern. I folded the letter carefully, pressing the crease with my palm. I placed it into the top drawer of the desk, the same drawer where he had hidden his own secrets, his torn pages, his unspoken words. This one, though, would remain, my truth to him waiting in the quiet. As I closed the drawer, I whispered into the darkened room, "Thank you, Dad." And for the first time, the silence that answered didn't feel empty. Morning light poured through the windows, filling the house with a gentleness I hadn't felt in weeks. It wasn't the harsh light of noon or the deep shadows of evening. It was soft, forgiving, like the kind of light that belongs to beginnings. I stood in the center of the living room, the floor beneath me creaking, the air tinged with the faint scent of old wood and dust. Around me, the house still held his presence, his chair by the window, the books lined neatly on their shelves, the clock that ticked a little too loudly. Yet something had shifted inside me. For so long, I had seen this place as a tomb of silence, each object another reminder of what he had lost for me. But now, as I looked closer, I realized it was more than that. It was a living map, a story he had written with every choice, every sacrifice, every quiet gesture, and it was mine to carry forward. I went first to the desk. The drawer where I had placed my letter still held the faint scent of ink and cedar. I opened it, touched the folded page, and let my hand rest there. For the first time, I didn't feel the ache of regret. Instead, I felt connection. My words beside his silence, my voice layered upon his quiet, father and daughter at last speaking across the divide. I closed the drawer gently, like sealing a promise. Next, I walked into the dining room. The table was cleared now. I had finally washed the plate, set the fork back in its place, emptied the glass. The placemat still bore its frayed edges, but it looked different. Not a wound anymore, but a marker of time, of use, of a life shared, however imperfectly. I pulled out his chair and sat for a while, letting the silence settle around me. This time it didn't feel heavy. It felt full, full of every dinner we had shared, every laugh, every quiet moment that had built the bond between us. Upstairs, I opened his closet. His jacket still hung in a neat row, the fabric softened from years of wear. I slipped one from its hanger and draped it around my shoulders. The weight of it was startling, the scent of him still clinging faintly in the lining. For a moment, I felt like a child again, enveloped in the safety of his embrace. I looked at myself in the mirror, his jacket swallowing me, the sleeves too long, and I smiled through the tears, because this was him still protecting me even now. Later, I carried the cassette player into the living room and pressed play. His voice filled the space once more, crackling, tender, resolute. "Promise me you won't choose silence." I closed my eyes and let it wash over me. This time it didn't break me. It steadied me. His words were no longer only a plea. They were instruction, a legacy. Not the house, not the money, not the contracts signed in sacrifice, but this, the reminder that love is not meant to be silence. that the greatest inheritance is not what is left in banks or deeds, but what is carried in the heart. And then, as if guided by his voice, I reached for the last thing I had avoided, the letter addressed to Evelyn. Its seal was brittle, the paper yellowed with time. My hands shook as I broke it open. The words inside were simple, almost ordinary. Gratitude, regret, love, nothing scandalous, nothing earth-shattering, just proof that his silence had been chosen, not forced. Proof that he had given her the same gift he gave me, the freedom to move forward. I folded the letter back and pressed it against my chest. And in that quiet moment I understood. Honoring him would not mean keeping silent. It would mean daring to speak, daring to live, daring to love without fear. As the tape clicked to an end, I looked around the house one last time. I knew I would leave soon, begin my own life outside these walls, take his lessons with me rather than let them haunt me here. But before I did, I whispered into the room, "Dad, I understand now, and I'll live the way you wanted me to. I'll live wide." The words lingered in the air, soft and sure, and for the first time I felt certain he heard me. Outside, the world was waiting. The air smelled of rain on pavement, fresh and earthy. Children's laughter drifted from somewhere down the street. A breeze brushed across my skin, cool and alive. I stepped out onto the porch, the weight of his jacket still around me, and breathed deeply. The legacy was not the house behind me, nor the accounts and papers tucked away. The legacy was this moment, the courage to breathe, to live, to carry forward the love he had poured into me in silence, now spoken aloud. And in that breath I felt him again. Not as absence, but as presence. Not as loss, but as legacy. Thank you for walking with me through this story. A story of a father who gave more than he ever said, of a daughter who only discovered the depth of his love when it was almost too late, and of the truth that family is not measured in wealth, but in the sacrifices we don't see until the silence is finally broken. If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you of someone you love, take a moment today to tell them. Don't wait. Don't leave words unspoken. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this about love, about family, about the ties that hold us together, please consider subscribing to this channel. Your support means more than you know. It helps keep these stories alive, carried from one heart to another. I wish you health, peace, and the warmth of family beside you. Until next time, take care of yourselves, and hold close the ones who matter most.